Oh, 45 degrees. It feels like it's like 28.
The wind chill.
Yeah, we're right by the river.
On a cold day in February of last year, we met Dr. David Childs, a professor at Northern Kentucky University, along the banks of the Ohio River.
Dr. Childs is an expert on the Black church and the Underground Railroad activity that occurred in this pivotal region on the border between Kentucky and Ohio.
We're walking next to the Jordan River, to Ohio River. There's a story in the Old Testament where the children of Israel crossed over Jordan.
In African American writings, stories, and songs, the Jordan River was code for the Ohio River, the river to freedom. And for good reason.
In 1787, the Ordinance of the Northwest Territory was passed. It was the first legal document in the history of mankind to outlaw human slavery.
This meant that the Ohio River, a body of water that can stretch up to a mile wide and get 20 feet deep, became the boundary separating this free territory in the north from the southern slave states below.
And a lot of people, when they envision the Underground Railroad, they envision people on foot, traveling miles and miles and miles. And that was a big part of it too. But a big part of the Underground Railroad was travel by any means necessary. And a lot of people don't realize enslaved people escaped on ferries.
And some even swam. Imagine what it would have felt like to stand on the banks of the Ohio River in Kentucky, knowing that it was your last river to cross, that freedom was just on the other side.
If you were desperate enough, swimming against the southwesterly current could have been your only option.
In fact, legend has it that in 1831, an enslaved man named Tice Davids escaped slavery by swimming across the Ohio River to the town of Ripley, Ohio.
His enslaver went to Ripley in pursuit, but was never able to find Davids. When he returned to Kentucky, he remarked, "It seems as if he went off on some underground railroad."
And so, some people say, the name the Underground Railroad was born.
Now, Davids probably didn't escape alone. He likely was aided by a network of people in Ripley, Underground Railroad conductors, who would have enabled him to vanish from plain sight.
To learn more about them, I decided to go to Ripley myself. So last summer, I drove about an hour southeast from my home in Cincinnati to this charming small town. I took U.S. Route 52, which traces the path of the Ohio River, for most of the ride. The last few miles were through winding, wooded roads, and I soon arrived at a small colonial house at the top of the hillside. A sign read, "The Rankin House."
Walking in to the Rankin House. It's kind of a small and assuming house, but it is very high up on the hill. We are super, super high up on the hill.
Eddie Campbell, the site manager of the Rankin House, met me at the door. This 19th century house had some 21st century security.
Okay, you can come in.
Thank you.
It makes sense. The Rankin House has become a popular tourist destination with hundreds of people coming and going every day. Once inside, I asked Betty to tell me more about the house and the family who called it home.
John and Jean Rankin had 13 children. We believe he chose this hillside location for a couple of reasons. A farm setting would take care of his ever-growing family. Also, this offered him a good view of Ripley. He kind of wanted to be able to be sure and see what was coming toward him, whether it was good or bad.
That made sense, given the family profession.
Reverend Rankin and his family were Underground Railroad conductors. So think about if you are the parents of 14-year-old David Rankin, giving him this responsibility of moving fugitives in the dark, on horseback, 5 miles north of here to a little community called Red Oak, and then come back home, and then get yourself ready to go to school in town and not tell a soul about what you've done. Because what you've been doing that night is an illegal act. Anybody who was an Underground Railroad conductor was breaking the law. Reverend Rankin wrote that over about a 40-year period, he and his family aided about 2,000 fugitive slaves.
And we know the story of at least one of those people, thanks to a little author you might have heard of.
The Rankins and the Beechers knew each other, and apparently the Rankin family felt comfortable enough sharing some of their secretive stories of helping people escape. And one of them was of a woman who escaped in the winter of 1838 with a small child. Fast forward a few years when Harriet is an author and is writing what will become Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her character Eliza is based on the woman I just told you about.
We're lucky to know so much about John Rankin, mostly thanks to his autobiography, which he wrote later in life, and the writings of his sons.
But when it comes to Black Underground Railroad conductors and safe houses owned by free Black people, we know a lot less.
Because white histories have been better preserved, you'd be forgiven for thinking that there were actually more white conductors than Black. But that just isn't the case.
The town of Ripley, Ohio, is one of the few places in the country where the stories of Black Underground Railroad conductors are not only being uncovered, but valued and preserved for posterity.
In this episode, we'll tell you their stories.
Welcome to Urban Roots, a podcast by Urbanist Media that preserves place through story.
We're your hosts. I'm Debla Hussein-Wetzel, historic preservationist.
And I'm Vanessa Quirk, a cities journalist focused on inclusive development.
And you're listening to part 1 of Ohio River to Freedom, a 2-part series on the abolitionist history of towns along the Ohio River.
Today's episode is part 1, Ripley. In the mid-1800s, Ripley was home to more abolitionists than any other small town in the U.S.
And it's where some of the most skilled Underground Railroad conductors in American history lived.
In this episode, we'll introduce you to 2 you likely never heard about in history class, Polly Jackson and John Parker.
But before we can tell you their heroic stories, first we need to tell you the history so you can understand how brave they really were.
We have so few historical remnants of Black Underground Railroad conductors for a few reasons.
First, most Black folks of this time period passed on their histories orally, from parent to child. In the past, many historians didn't consider these stories legitimate sources.
Second, this was just really perilous stuff to talk about. Even though Ohio was a free state, it was still a dangerous place for African Americans, especially Southern Ohio. In 1793, the Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave hunters to track down and capture enslaved people in free territories and bring them back to their Southern owners.
If you were white and helping enslaved folks escape, you might be fined or jailed if you were caught. But if you were Black, you could be killed.
So obviously, if you were helping people escape from slavery, you didn't exactly want to signpost your plans for anyone to come across. You would destroy any evidence of your activities. Here's Dr. David Childs again.
Underground means that was hidden. There was no manual. There's some documentation we do have that was preserved, the little that we know. The Underground Railroad was a network that connected places. How did they communicate? Through word of mouth, through secret code, through lectures, churches, and the songs.
Songs were critical, especially since many enslaved people weren't allowed to learn how to read or write.
And so in my research on the spirituals, they had double, sometimes triple meanings. And so often they would have a secular meaning, well, let's say a physical meaning. This is a good time to run to the next Underground Railroad station. Let's steal away. And then, of course, it had a spiritual meaning. At some point, we won't have to always suffer on this earth, and we're going to be able to steal away to Jesus. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. Ain't got long to stay here.
While researching for this episode, I came across an oral history and music project compiled in 1996 called Talking Across the Lines. In it, historians, along with people who are descendants of enslaved people and Underground Railroad workers, told their stories, some of which came directly from grandparents or great-grandparents, and many of those folks mentioned songs too. Here's Ethel Caffey Austin.
Many of your spirituals had coded messages in them. Swing low, sweet chariot, if you get there before I do. Tell all of my friends I'm a-coming too did not necessarily mean that they were talking about going to heaven. They're spontaneous songs, so somebody was ad-libbing, and so there many times the ad-libbing had something to do with what was about to take place.
They might sing, "Run, Mary, run, I say, run, Mary, run, I say, run on, Mary, run, I say, you got a right to the tree of life."
LaRon Williams.
And that was a signal that the next day was time to run. Or they might say, "Run, Mary, run in the morning, And that's when the morning would be the time to go. Or they'd say in the evening, and they'd know, everybody's running in the evening. It's time to go. And then, the people might run, and they'll get a certain distance, and then the hounds go out after them. So the signal might be wade in the water, and everybody's singing wade in the water all along this passage route, wade in the water, children. And that's the signal that you can't stay on the land anymore. You got to walk in the water because the dogs can't follow the scent through water. And there were a lot of things like that. So that while the song may sound like a spiritual song, there's a double meaning.
Wade in the water, children, wade in the water.
A Ripley resident, Reverend James Settles, told me that his grandfather came from Kentucky to Ripley with about 6 others and 1 baby in the dead of night.
As they made their way to the river, they came to a fence. They had to toss the baby over the fence. Luckily, she didn't start to cry. My grandfather had made an arrangement with someone to leave a boat, and so they got in the boat and they floated down the river and eventually made their way to Eagle Creek, just outside of Ripley. A couple of nights later, he went back and got 6 more.
Reverend Settle's story has an important detail that I want to point out. Somehow, via song or coded message or some other means, Settle's great-grandfather got word to somebody in Ripley about a boat.
Whoever that person was, they likely were a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
God's gonna trouble the water.
Okay, I think this is a great time to finally get into the stories of Ripley's Black Underground Railroad conductors. So, the first person I want to talk about is Polly Jackson, the ancestor of Ripley resident Amber Dudley. Okay, Decca, you ready to hear about Miss Polly Jackson?
Yeah, lay it on me.
Polly Jackson and her brother Lindsay were born enslaved in Virginia. Not much is known about that part of their lives, but we do know that at some point in the 1840s, they somehow gained their freedom and moved to Africa, a small community next to Ripley, Ohio, that offered African Americans free land to settle on. Lindsay got a job working on the Rankin farm, and they both soon joined the Underground Railroad. Now, enslaved people fleeing north would occasionally cross over the Jackson land, and Polly and Lindsay would take the potentially mortal risk of allowing people to shelter on their property. And they would also sometimes see slave hunters capture people on or near their land, which frankly made Polly furious. So she decided she wanted to do something about it. You ready, Decca?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm still here.
All right, I hope you're dying to find out. Okay, so this is what she does. She dresses up as this very frail-looking elderly lady. And, slave hunters, they generally had no interest in older folks in general. So she's looking all defenseless, and she would be like hobbling towards them, holding her cloak close to her. But underneath her cloak, she was packing. She had both a butcher knife and a kettle of boiling water.
Oh, yowza. Well, don't mess with Aunt Polly.
Don't mess with Aunt Polly. No. So she would hobble up to them and she'd wait for just the right time and then, attack. And no one ever saw her coming.
Wow, they definitely should not have underestimated her.
Yeah, seriously. It's a beautiful story, but unfortunately, there aren't any physical traces left of Polly or Lindsay Jackson. Their property isn't marked, and there's nowhere you can go to learn about her.
But Polly isn't the only Black conductor famous in Ripley. After I went to the Rankin house last summer, Betty told me where I had to go next in Ripley. So I got in the car and headed down the hill, all the way to the riverfront, and got out at the John Parker House, a charming federal-style brick building on Front Street, facing the Ohio River.
I'd like to take this opportunity, if I can, to officially welcome you to the John Parker home.
That genteel voice belongs to Dewey Scott, the manager and docent of the John P. Parker House.
And this is the only home that John ever owned. He lived in this house for 50 years.
Mr. Scott proceeded to show me around the museum and tell me about the life of John Parker, whose story begins in Norfolk, Virginia in 1827.
His mother was Black. She was a slave. His father was white, and we do believe him to have been the slaveholder. If, in fact, he was, well, he sold his son into slavery at the tender young age of 8 years old, stripped from his mother, never ever to see her again in life. Marched the distance of 100 miles he was, to Richmond, Virginia, where he was placed upon the blocks to be sold for a second time. He ended up in Mobile, where he was placed upon the blocks to be sold for a third time. Not yet 10 years old, the young fellows already had 3 owners. This time he became the property of a doctor who used the lad as a livery mate. He took care of the horses.
The doctor in Mobile had 2 sons that were younger than John. John took them under his wing.
Taught them to hunt, taught them to fish, taught them Indian woodlore, the ways of the woods, just as he had learned. They, in return, they snuck books from the doc's library and taught young John Parker to read. This was illegal, for most states had it on the books as a law that you did not educate a person of color in any fashion whatsoever. John took to these readings and loved it. Now, as time rolled along, one day the doc, he pulled John aside, sat him down, had a talk with him, a discussion. Told him flat out that if he didn't want to go to the fields, it would be most wise if he were to learn a trade. John did take on a couple of trades, but the one that was most important and the one that made such a difference in his young life was that of a foundry worker. For he learned how to make metal pieces in a foundry and found at this time that he had a talent, a gift, a knack. This gift, God-given. One of the persons John had an occasion to speak with at this time was a lady. Very powerful woman this was, very wealthy lady. Had her own plantation, had her own set of slaves. She was a widow. Her name, Elizabeth Ryder. And John asked her, please, oh please, Miss Ryder, would she not buy him from the dock, allow him to pay her back, and thereby gain his freedom in such a fashion?
Ms. Ryder accepted, charging him $1,800. That's the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today.
John was able to pay Miss Ryder that $1,800 that she demanded in its entirety in 1.5 years. Now, John was so happy to gain his freedom, he was simply elated. He went home, placed his shirt on the kitchen table, placed his freedom papers in the middle of the back of that shirt, covered them with another piece of cloth, and actually stitched them up into the back of his shirt as not to lose his papers. He also bought at this time a passport, for if you were black or of color and you wanted to ride the riverboats of the day, it was a mandatory must that you had a passport.
John took his passport and left Alabama. He made his way to Indiana and then to Cincinnati, where he met the woman that would become his wife.
Miranda Bolden. Miranda, like he, was a mulatto, half white, half black. The difference being she had never, ever been a slave, always been a free person of color. They worked the general store for 1 year, and with that money and the money John had saved in Indiana, they bought this dirt that we are sitting upon today. Started building this house late 1849, moved into it late 1850.
John and Miranda would raise 6 children in this house. It also generated economic opportunity for the family. John attached a foundry to his new home.
It morphed into a larger foundry that ran all the way back to the alley. There were larger foundries in Cincinnati, but once you got past Cincinnati, then John Parker's was the largest foundry till you got to the Mississippi River. He employed 25 people, both black and white at the time.
John Parker was running a very successful enterprise here in Ripley, but that was just his day job.
Immediately upon John's arrival into Ripley, he started his work on and became a part of the Underground Railroad.
His first mission was helping 2 girls escape from Kentucky. John was immediately hooked.
For it's here at this point in time, the decision was made. This is what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. He had found his calling. He knew why God put him on this earth. Not only was John a conductor on the Underground Railroad, he was an extractor. Very, very few extractors in our history, especially black ones. For extracting, it's extremely dangerous. The most famous extractor of this time period was Harriet Tubman. She would go into Virginia, bringing slaves from Virginia. John did much the same. He would go into Kentucky, which he called the borderlands, bringing the slaves from Kentucky over to Ohio, which he called his promised land.
And keep in mind, Parker gets into the game at literally the most dangerous moment in American history, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850.
Yeah, it's worth taking a brief pause from John's story to explain what this was, because as we mentioned earlier, there was already a law on the books in 1793 that made it legal for slave hunters to catch freedom seekers in northern states. So what changed with this law?
Yeah, well, in 1850, as tensions between the North and South were boiling over, the U.S. government decided it needed to throw the South a bone to appease their discontent. As part of the Great Compromise of 1850, they gave the Fugitive Slave Act teeth it never had before.
So this act was a game changer. Before, people in northern states, they weren't super motivated to help slave catchers out.
Understandably.
Right. But now, post-1850, the federal government, its marshals, its deputies, now they have to participate in helping slave catchers. And then on the flip side, assisting enslaved people is now a felony.
Okay, so let's get back to John Parker. Despite this law, he was successfully extracting dozens of enslaved people regularly and raising the ire of a lot of slaveholders. Eventually, a reward of $1,000 was posted for Parker, dead or alive.
Very, very dangerous this was. For had John been caught any given night fooling around over in Kentucky like this, only one question was to be asked, and that's who's got the rope?
After seeing this poster, he was more cautious. He burned his diary that listed the 440 enslaved freedom seekers he'd helped, and he never allowed his photo to be taken. Fortunately, John Parker was skilled, lucky, or both.
John Parker rescued some 600 to 900 people in his time of fill. John was never caught, nor did he ever lose a fugitive.
In 1900, at the age of 73, John Parker died in his bed. His wife Miranda sold the house a few years later.
By 1910, she was gone, and all evidences of John Parker was gone along with him.
Well, not all evidence. As an older man, John had been interviewed by a journalist who wrote a biography of Mr. Parker. Luckily, that journalist's notes were saved and given to Duke University. In 1996, a historical society in Ripley formed to try and find more information about Parker. They stabilized John's house, conducted an archaeological investigation, and started collecting oral histories.
Dewey is part of that group working to keep the memory of John Parker alive. He told me that while John did so much alone, he also constantly worked with others, white and black.
Whereas in other cities, white folks did their thing, black folks did their thing. Both were effective, but they did not work together. Here in Ripley, they did. But here in this little one-horse town of Ripley, Ohio, there were 329 people listed on the rosters of the abolitionists. And nowhere, and I do mean nowhere in this here United States, are you going to find an abolitionist society anywhere near that large. Not even close.
Walking around Ripley after my tour of the Parker house, I could feel how special this town along the Ohio River is.
A lot of African Americans gained their freedom through this place. I think that's what's pretty magical about being in this location right now.
And people didn't just move through Ripley. Some decided to stay there and make a life, like John Parker and the Jacksons and Reverend James Settle's great-grandfather.
Right, the gentleman you heard about who escaped to Ripley on a boat after having to toss a baby over a fence.
My great-grandfather had the foresight to set aside plans for his family. 2, had the courage to execute those plans. And then 3, built a life in the very community that he escaped to. And then he also volunteered to serve in the Civil War.
When he returned from the war, James's great-grandfather came to own a farm in Ripley and joined Beebe Church. This Methodist church is still going strong today. Reverend Settles was once its pastor.
We take a little bit of pride in knowing that we were founded by people who had been in slavery. The very religion itself was a point of hope. When the world said you were less than worthy, the Bible says that you are. That was a point of hope for the black community at that time. And we find hope in knowing that our history tells us that you can overcome. So I used to go through the old records sometime and just see how much of a sacrifice those original members and members that followed them made. There's value in knowing that. If they could overcome all of that, then certainly I can contend with what I had come up against.
I'll go home to my Lord and be free.
All along the Ohio River, Black communities lived and sacrificed and put their lives in peril to help others live and die free. Ripley is a prime example of that. And just up the river, on the way to Cincinnati, another town was a hub of abolitionist activity, and remarkably for the time period, became a vibrant Black community in its own right.
In part 2 of our Ohio River to Freedom series, we'll share that story.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media that preserves place through story.
Your hosts are me, Dara Hussein Wetzel, and Vanessa Quirk.
This episode was written by me, Vanessa, and Francis Ramirez O'Shea of Alta Gracia Media. It was produced by me, Francis, and Decca.
It was edited by Connor Lynch and mixed by Andrew Calloway. Our theme song is by Adam James Levin Arity. Thanks also to Sophia Ferris Rowe for their support. Thanks to Betty Campbell, Dewey Scott, and Dr. David Childs for lending their voices and expertise to this episode.
Also thanks to Michael and Carrie Klein, who recorded the oral histories and spirituals you heard throughout this episode as part of their 1996 Talking Across the Lines project, featuring people in Ohio and West Virginia who are descendants of enslaved people and Underground Railroad conductors, along with historians telling stories near and dear to them. In this episode, you heard the spirituals "Oh Freedom Over Me," sung by Ethel Caffey Austin, and "Wade in the Water," sung by Emma Perry Freeman.
The Ohio River to Freedom series was made possible thanks to funding from the Ohio Arts Council, Cincinnati Public Radio, and the private donations of the Muhammad family and Hub and Weber.
Special thanks to Janelle Walton of Cincinnati Public Radio for her collaboration on this series and the Juneteenth Cincinnati Shorts, which are playing on WVXU 91.7 and WGUC 90.9 throughout the month of June.
Urbanist Media is a 501c3 nonprofit. If you believe in preserving place through story and want to help us make more episodes like this one, then please consider donating to us via Venmo or PayPal at Urbanist Media. The links are also on our website, www.urbanistmedia.org.
While you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter or follow us on our LinkedIn or Instagram at Urban Roots Culture and find out when new episodes are ready to drop. Our next episode coming is part 2 of this Ohio River to Freedom series, New Richmond. Okay, I think we've done it, Decca. Can you hit the good people with our new tagline?
Urban Roots, preserving place through story.